Design is a death trap if you don't do it right.
Kind of the way I think about like design is there's, functional design and aesthetic design.
We create designs with the intent of destroying them. Just like in science where you formulate a theory and then try to disprove it, you're not validating it. People in business keep saying we validated things. No, nobody has ever validated anything. You can only invalidate something.
Medtech is something that's near and dear to my heart, but it's been a frustrating industry to be in.
The reason for that is that you have a lot of incumbents. This is a market that's dominated by incumbents, and they don't progress sufficiently.
It's hard to be the best in the world at like one thing. Like if all you do is throw a javelin, there's a lot of people that are really good at throwing a javelin.
I mean, A/B testing is a method that you can use. It's basically where you compare two options and see how they perform. I think this is part of the larger thinking where
Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Spencer Jones of the Medtech Innovation Podcast from Medtech. I am super thrilled today to have with us Dennis Lenard. Dennis has 15 years of experience in the design of medical interfaces, including medical software, devices, web applications, and even mobile apps. At Creative Navy, he leads a team of design experts and champions the approach of evidence-based design, which we will get more into because I love that term. Dennis has spent thousands of hours interviewing both medical staff and patients. Additionally, Dennis is a lecturer at King's College and a published author in the area of GUI design for Medtech. I found Dennis's profile. I don't know. I think I literally just found you. Maybe one of us DM'd each other. I can't remember. But I just remember seeing your profile and was like, I have to talk to this guy. And we've had a couple of calls since, and it's just been fun. It's been exciting. So Dennis, welcome to the pod. Where do we find you today?
Hello, everyone. I'm in Germany at our office. It's empty. I sent everyone home. So, Christmas coming up, so nobody complained. But it's good to be here and speak to you. I'm really excited to see what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, man, I'm excited too. It's nice of you to send everybody home kind of early for the holidays. But so one thing that I find kind of fascinating about you, and I'm just very curious, I know the audience is probably interested in this too, but Medtech specific graphical user interface, right? As well as UI, UX that goes along with it. That is a very specific niche. And I'm just curious kind of your journey and how you got to being an expert in Medtech GUI.
I would call it an unfolding. Actually met this offer of interesting things to learn. So I became a little bit greedy and I did 4 degrees in 5 years. It was cognitive science, it was law, it was business and communication. And it seems as if these have nothing to do in common except for interface design. Because interface design is actually an interesting thing because it has to sit at the intersection of all of these. On the one hand, you have users as actual people with their needs as actual messy human beings. You have systems, be they legal systems or technical systems, whatever that is. And then you have this aspect of trying to make things interact or communicate in a way that works. And ideally, this should also work in such a way that it doesn't, deplete resources, but rather produces more. So I got into this field. It felt very natural at the time. Well, this heavy approach to design also led me to desire to do something with it that is, more than just a website or just a social media app, which has no purpose. And this field is, of course, Medtech, where everything is, I think more complicated than in other fields. But also, if you manage to get it right and to launch a product that actually helps people, you just sleep better at night.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I talk a lot about being a versatile athlete, right? In terms of entrepreneurs, but really even just as professionals. And really, it's hard to be the best in the world at one thing. If all you do is throw a javelin, there's a lot of people that are really good at throwing a javelin, right? But if you've got a really unique skill set and knowledge base, and I imagine with a law degree as well as a cognitive science degree and all those other things, that kind of made you, thinking of a key going into a door, right? A very, the teeth on your key are very versatile and can open a lot of doors, right? It's easy when you have that kind of diverse versatility to be top of your field, top of your class, across those different things. So no, that's super interesting. I'm curious, and I know you work with companies in the US as well as across the pond. Medtech is something that's near and dear to my heart, but it's been a frustrating industry to be in over the past 2 years, frankly. So, I'm curious kind of your read on the medtech market right now, just in general, and, whether you see the opportunities are abundant or the opportunities are scarce.
Well, I think generally if you're in this field, you can't expect to have a return in a few months. I don't think that's realistic thinking, but I think there are a lot of opportunities and probably you'll have more opportunities day by day. And the reason for that is that you have a lot of incumbents. This is a market that's dominated by incumbents and they don't progress sufficiently. They don't drive innovation as much as they can, or they're used to taking things slow, but actually because there's so much change in the world and there's so much new tech out there and there's just so much information and everything is a lot more global, this creates so much opportunity that's just not harnessed by any of these incumbents. And as a new player, that's, as you said, a versatile athlete, you can actually do so much in this industry, even though it might seem impossible in the beginning.
No, I totally agree. I mean, there are very few of them I feel like have even like realized there is like a shift happening in the industry or like are trying to adapt to it. I also think too, like one of the reasons the incumbents are very frustrating is because through being a massive incumbent with other kind of incumbents adjacent to them, right? I'm thinking insurance and GPOs and all of those things, right? Even large health systems and IDNs. Like there are all of these artificial barriers that kind of prop up their incumbency where you're not even playing on a level playing field, right? Like they're not looking at both products side by side and saying, okay, I'm going to look at price and clinical value. It's so much like, well, what other contracts do we have with them? And then what's on my GPO contract? And how are they bundling, these service lines and product lines together and giving me discounts and rebates? And are they paying exorbitant consulting fees to surgeons and clinicians, right? So like there are so many, it feels like, artificial barriers that are basically subsidizing, their incumbency and like, defending or helping them, keep those competitors at bay, right? These young up-and-comers at bay, even though they like are not innovating themselves and really adapting to what's changing. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think this is true. And I think it used to be sort of a monopoly that was impossible to break for a long time. But because the discrepancies got so huge, cracks appear. And sometimes when something cracks a little bit, it will then split open. I think we've seen this, for example, in Europe. This has clearly happened with challenger banks. I know the US is slightly slower because, again, there's a lot of regulation and, as you say, these barriers that are artificially in place to protect the incumbents. But even there, you have Chime, you have Current, we have lots of them picking up really quickly. What's happening in Europe is that they already completely broke the market. I mean, you have these challenger banks that are now bigger than the biggest banks, and they just came out of nothing. And in a few years, they reshaped something that was thought to be immutable and impossible to be changed. And look, here it is. It's happened.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that line about they're just like, when the disparity gets large, right, cracks appear and they get wider and then you can squeeze through them, right? And I think it takes a keen eye and a bias to action, right? And kind of like being at the right place to kind of like see the crack opening and then squeeze through it, right? But like a lot of the up and comers, right, if you have that mentality, you can do it. So I want to talk about design a little bit here, right? So great designs with initial concepts. I know we've talked about like that's just like really, really critical, whether it's prototypes or sketches or whatever, but like talk to me about how you think about kind of design in those earliest stages and kind of like what it can do for people, how people might overlook it, but like what it can really do, like what's the true value of like really leaning into design early.
I think what's unique about design in an early phase is that it creates a feeling of knowing. There's this concept in cognitive science, which is not so much about what you know, but just having the feeling that you know. Because something that's funny and tricky about the human mind is that when it accesses information, it doesn't distinguish between you actually having that represented in your mind and you're just accessing it in the moment. So it's just like when you watch a documentary, it feels as if you know so much about those animals, but actually, once the documentary stops, you know nothing about the animals anymore. So design has this effect because rather than listening in on something that's complicated to imagine, because it's just words, you can see something. It gives you this feeling of, oh, I know this, I understand this. Chances are I can actually form some sort of representation in my mind because it's easier to digest. But even just having this feeling gives me trust.
Yeah.
In this early stage, whether you want to have investors trust you or just potential team members or partners, potential clients, whoever it is, that's a game changer, partly because it's the only thing you have, right? Ultimately, people just bet on an idea, and design has that power.
I totally agree. I mean, we talk about the power of the prototype a lot, right? And another thing I think specifically medtech innovators kind of like forget about is that, there was a study came out and it was like 40% or 60%, but like some massive percent of people, they like just don't have an internal monologue, right? Like they're just kind of like, droning through things. But I think in a similar respect, there are so many people that just, it's hard for them to like truly crystallize a visual concept in their mind if they're not shown it. Like you could describe something to them, and if it's abstract or kind of like something they just haven't seen before, which is the nature of innovations, right? Like it's going to be so difficult for them to really capture it and grasp it. And like you said, they don't feel like they know it, right? If they can't see it in front of them. So, but I would say most innovators, right? Most entrepreneurs, like they are aspirational. They can ideate and really like form a visual representation of their mind to kind of create that knowing sense. But most people just don't have that, right? And, a lot of investors, they're, for better or for worse, a lot of them are pencil pushers and like, on the accounting side or the finance side. And so like they may be talented in a million other ways, but they may not have that either. So I totally agree. Like we talk about in XO a lot, like selling the vision, like you're selling the thing that you're going to build, right? You may show them bits of it along the way, but you want to show them and sell them on kind of what it's going to be, right? The potential in the future there, so I totally agree. Like, I've seen actually, believe it or not, Dennis, I've seen decks where they literally have like, just like napkin sketches on there and then financial projections of like, 5 million in year one. I'm just like, you're doing it all wrong, man. You're doing it all wrong. Yeah. So like talking about design, and again, like feel free to disagree. Kind of the way I think about like design is there's, functional design and aesthetic design. Like I need, functional, I need this gear to do this thing. Aesthetic is, okay, what are the design constraints for the housing or container that this gear needs to go in, right? All of those things. So kind of how do you, from a GUI perspective, delineate or differentiate from your design process on functional versus aesthetic?
Well, I think the starting point is really to focus on the function. The reason for that is that you can sort of fake aesthetics up to a certain point, but beauty without meaning is nothing. It doesn't work. I mean, just look at postmodernism, right? It tries to put things together just for the sake of it and then hopes that people invest it with meaning. And we've tried it many millions of times and it just doesn't work. On the other hand, if you have meaning in something, it evokes an emotional response. It makes people bond with it. It makes people exchange that shared meaning. And that's actually also how the aesthetics and the beauty comes into it. And the thing is that aesthetics also has a functional quality. It plays a role within that. And so if you really focus on the function at first and a lot, that means actually pushing through, taking it to the extreme, persisting even when it feels as if it's in vain, and just keep going and keep going and keep going, then you actually get to a point where you end up with a design that is unique and it just turns out to be beautiful. It doesn't feel like that. It's counterintuitive when you're actually doing it, but having done it so many times, this is what really happens. On the other hand, if you just start with an aesthetic, it's going to be just that, an empty form without any meaning, and it will fade away, people will ignore it eventually, or perhaps it will never catch on. But something that's useful, taken to the extreme, also becomes beautiful.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. Like, as we're talking about this, I'm kind of Apple's design is always amazing, right? But just thinking about the simplicity of the iPhone and like the focus on the function and it, even just the home button being where it is, you know what I mean? Close to the thumb. And then the other thing, I'd say on the fully flip side, there was this really interesting period. I saw a video the other day where cell phones went from being these like huge bricks to where they were like very small mobile phones, right? And there is just a sea of insanely designed phones that have swivel this and like the keypads are bent and it's a keypad but then it pops open and then it's a full keypad. Like there was just so many wild, let's just do this for fun kind of thing. And maybe they were just like, the executives were like, I had an idea, make this, you know what I mean? But I think those are kind of the two extremes. But last like little proof point on this too, like I think it was, we were kind of doing the mobile application, right, for medtechvendors.com, the app, and we were kind of like, looking at some design inspiration, right, from some other good mobile apps. And we saw like on Airbnb, like if you go to log in or sign up or whatever, it's just kind of like this like footer banner that slides up. It kind of looks odd. And then we were like, man, it's just when you reach for it with your thumb, you're like, man, that was so easy and felt good, right? But like the placement of that, right, was strictly function, right? More so than aesthetic. But then when it's on the screen, it still looks gorgeous too, right? Like the way it unfolds and stuff like that. So I think, big highlight there is what I'm hearing you say is if you focus and obsess over getting the function as high value and meeting the user needs in the best way possible, it's going to kind of become elegant as just a sheer byproduct of that intense functionality.
Yeah, and that's because people need aesthetics. I think we oftentimes think of beauty or aesthetics as a luxury when it is not. It's absolutely necessary in everything as long as it has meaning. If it loses the meaning, then it's not even a luxury anymore. It's useless. But as people, we need beauty because beauty is the element of being simple, of being well organized, being easy to understand, having the right emotions at the right time. So, if you unpick the idea of aesthetics, it suddenly becomes about how people work, what their needs are. So we get into function. But there is, of course, if it gets to that super high level of excellence, it also has a quality of its own. That's why, a sunset is beautiful.
No, it's such a good point. Such a good point. So you mentioned this about the incumbents, right? And they're not innovating, and that's why there's cracks that are opening. I feel like, how do you think design plays a role in kind of competing with incumbents and trying to set your product apart? I'm just specific to medtech, right? Like, how does the power of design set products apart and help you challenge incumbents better?
The thing with design is that it's difficult to do. I think it's more difficult to do than some of the other things. And it is difficult to do because it has that area of ambiguity where it's uncertain what the right thing to do would be. And if you bring an incumbent to that battlefield, what they will do is they will throw a lot of people at it. They will throw a lot of process, a lot of PDFs and PowerPoints and meetings, and a lot of people just, trying to cover for themselves. That's why they have a very difficult time actually bringing something that users relate to. Again, going back to that example with the banks, it's sort of a thing that we just accept that banks absolutely don't care at all about people. We just accept it as if that would be normal when it is not. And then when someone comes along who cares a little bit about people and, just has an interface that works and that doesn't scam you completely, just partially, it's a revolution in the industry. And I think we see the same thing in medtech, where we don't dare to say that incumbents don't care about the users and the patients, but then in practice, oftentimes it feels that way, and I think there's some substance to that. And it's not ill-intention. I think they're so detached from reality in the meantime that they can't do it even if they try, or if they manage to bring out something that is great as a product, it's just a coincidence. And so design can actually level the battlefield because it's not about having a big team. You don't need 20 designers to do something. In fact, I would argue that's counterproductive. You need the right people with the right process to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like, I've been a part of the design process for multiple medtech products. Like, having the right size team, like you said, is important, but having like the right culture of the people on the team that are driving design is just so critical because, like you said, people are covering. They may not want to go out on a limb, right, and disagree, because if they're wrong, then their boss may not give them the Christmas bonus or the raise or whatever, right? And that comes from not having a good culture. But also, I think something that you can see in product development and design when there's poor culture is people feel like they have too much idea ownership and it's chips on a table, right? Oh, well, we used your idea for this feature, so we have to use my idea on this next feature.
Yeah.
But when you have like a true kind of team that's all kind of collectively every day coming in and experience that ego death, you really put all of the ideas on the table. Doesn't matter whose idea it was. The best idea wins. The best design wins. And you can really pick it apart. But I've seen, if you don't have that, if you have that, hoarding of chips and it's my turn, it's your turn, and everybody's covering for themselves, it just completely adulterates the design process, and the impurity of that ends up kind of, perverting the design in a way, usually and almost always not for the better, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, people don't even notice it while they're doing it, but, if you stray away just for a little bit and you keep going, 2 months later, you're in a place where you're wondering, what is this thing even?
Yeah, it's like the rudder on a ship, right? You're just a couple degrees off, and then you end up in the Bermuda Triangle, and you're just lost. You're just lost.
Yeah.
No, and one quick point before I get to the next question, like about, design and using it as a tactic to overcome and challenge incumbents. I saw something the other day. It was about Yahoo and Google, right? Like Yahoo, people forget Yahoo had a head start on Google, right, in search. And back then, if you went to Yahoo's page, it was just kind of littered with crap, right? It was just like not super attractive, not super usable. You could argue that nothing back then in that web era was super attractive, but Google's was just so dead simple. It was Google and then the call to action. What do they want you to do? Search bar, type it in, hit search, right? And they, like, obviously we all know how that turned out for Google, but it just goes to show you, I think, two things, right? That complexity in design's not always great, but then and simplicity can really win, but it's not about overdoing it. Just because you're incumbents, you can try less hard and win. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
So we kind of have been hitting on this, but I just want to dive like a little bit deeper. But it definitely seems like large medtech companies struggle specifically with GUI, kind of the UI UX design. And like coming from my nursing background, I dealt with this, whether it's glucometers or infusion pumps or, even charting software to a degree. Like it just seemed like I'm like, who the hell designed this? Because it was like they never talked to a nurse about it at all. But, why do you think, it was specifically with GUI, like that these like large medtech companies struggle?
Well, it's actually interesting because the whole idea of ergonomics, so that means the attempt to improve something for the people using it, actually started in this field, in the field of medical devices. And it just stopped quite quickly. I mean, they set a very low bar and then they stopped with that instead of keeping pushing on that. And I think it really is a culture thing where for a long time they didn't try because they figured, well, it doesn't matter for the users because we can just force them to use whatever we're giving them. But there's also this idea of, oh, he's a doctor, so he should be smart and know how to use this thing, even though it's stupid, but he's a doctor, so he can solve all of humanity's problems. This element of just passing the buck, I think that's very, very common in a lot of industries, especially with larger companies, because it's just a culture thing. And then the opposite of that is actually trying to take responsibility and say, I will make this great, even though I don't know how to do that. I will just do it. It's just like going for the first time to the North Pole. I don't know how it works, but I will just do it. I will figure it out. And if I die along the way, well, it is what it is. But at least I'm trying to do something. So I think this period is completely missing. And you can see that. And of course, if you have this element of companies being able to secure an advantage by doing other things, like intervening in regulation, setting up other barriers and so on, then maybe the return isn't there on design until it starts to be there. And then it's too late. They can't change rudder in a month. They need many, many years in the best case. I mean, I've worked with a lot of large medtech companies. I see them struggle and I see them form teams and try to change the mentality. And eventually, after years, they manage to form a team with the right mentality, but it still sits in an organization where it's not heard. So they are not empowered. They cannot do anything. So it takes at least a decade or two for this kind of change to occur. So I think that's why we have these opportunities.
That's such an interesting point. I forgot that whole human-centered design, human factors, really did start in a lot of ways, ergonomics in medical device. But I think I see this throughout medtech, frankly, too, though. This kind of okay, I learned something at a certain level, and even if it's at a relatively rudimentary level, there's this kind of arrogance of well, I don't need to advance. I kind of know what I know, and it got me what I needed at that time. And it's just they don't understand that there's intrinsic value in trying to kind of level up your understanding and digging into that process again. I think you see that a lot, even with medtech innovators, they'll get a piece of advice about something or read an article and they're oh, I understand this. And then they kind of lose that curiosity, I think is a better way to say it, right? Lose the curiosity about the value of going deeper on something like that. But I think another reason that these large medtech companies sometimes overlook, don't do it well with GUI is the people in a lot of cases that are using the devices are not truly the decision makers on the decision to purchase and adopt. And I'm thinking any product that's used by a nurse, very few health systems are having the nurse users vote on whether to use it or not. So kind of that user experience is almost completely removed, other than just some very core functional, can it do what it's intended to do? The actual subjective user experience is completely taken out of the decision-making process, which for any B2C product, right? How that product makes them feel is so important for the buying decision to occur. It's just almost completely gone, right? It's all contracted purchasing and how commoditized is this and how cheap can we get it? And, all of that. So it's, I think, kind of the incentives around the buying decisions and the people influencing those decisions are removed from the user experience process. And it's just not good. It's not good for GUI. And it's, I think, how we got here with a lot of these horribly designed GUI. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's actually quite an interesting example with electronic medical records. I mean, at first it was a theory or an idea, and everybody thought, oh, this is great. It's going to completely transform everything for the better. Let's do it. And then they did it and completely ignored this element of design. And as you said, they didn't ask users or consider that element. And now we have lots of these systems. We've benchmarked a few hundreds of these worldwide. I mean, we try to score them and we realized there's sort of no point in scoring them on a scale from 1 to 10 because it's just lots of 1s and 2s and maybe a 3 here and there. And then we figured, what the hell is going on? This must have died. This cannot be real. And then I did some more research, and there's so many studies that show that actually electronic healthcare records cause a lot of burnout with doctors. So they're actively harming things. All of this is proven and known to be bad, yet it doesn't change because now we're here in this position and it's difficult to produce the change. But this happens precisely because the people using the system weren't really included in the conception of it, in the purchasing of it, in any of this.
Yeah, I mean, I also think too, and I don't know, kind of I'm trying to think chronologically back to the advent of EMRs, and these electronic health records. And it's where was design and GUI from a technical standpoint when they started? And then they were just building tech stacks and things on each other. I don't think those systems are running on MS-DOS or anything, but I'm sure they're not running, on kind of the more advanced platforms. So I'm also curious because they didn't think about it at all before. before, like I'm wondering like how much front end, CSS or JavaScript can you actually run, and format on the front end of a lot of these EHRs, or like I'm wondering how many other factors that, like, if there's anybody that's just beating the drum inside these organizations to be like, we have to improve the user interface, and they were like, we can't dump our entire code base we've been using since 1998.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a factor. But even with that, you don't have to do anything that's fancy in order for it to be good. I always make the distinction between designing things right, so that's, let's say, just the aesthetics of it or the colors and that sort of stuff, and designing the right thing, which means giving people the right features in the right way. For example, when we create a design, in the early phase, everything's black and white, and it's very boring. It doesn't have, everything's just rectangles and so on. But there's a lot of detail, and it looks like the real thing. It's just rectangles and black and white.
Yeah,
and
like lo-fi.
But the point is, we want to get that to the level where users say, you know what, this is useful, I understand it, I can use it. It's super dull, but other than that, it's better than what I already have. Because if we manage to do that, then of course we can bring in some of these special effects and the colors that make it even better. But you can never solve a UX problem with a button. There's no point. Just changing the color on something doesn't solve the fact that it shouldn't be there in the first place. Or the fact that you have 20 items in a menu. What's the point of a menu if you have 20 items?
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, I was just looking yesterday, doing some like research and talking about, choice architecture and kind of the core pillars of it and whatnot. And, overloading people with both contextual information as well as too many options, it just cripples them. Right? Like our brains just kind of like just give up, and it's crazy to think that like humans are just so amazing. But especially when it's things where you're trying to kind of like move quick and like you really can just fry someone's brain if you give them like too much contextual information or too many options to choose from. And it can result in either like them basically like timing out or giving up or an error. Right?
Yeah, and there are lots of negative consequences, and that's the thing with design. When we design, we don't just try to make something pretty. There's a lot of work that precedes that element. And one of the things is you have to decide what you're actually trying to achieve with a particular flow or screen or even with the entire device. And that has to be operationalized. So that means making it mean something pragmatic. For example, reducing certain kinds of errors or ensuring that someone can complete this process in a given time, or even that someone who's never done this before can do it without reading a user manual. So there's about 40 of them actually that we've indexed or so far experienced to exist. And then you're trying to do something on purpose, because that's the thing with design. Design is a death trap if you don't do it right. That's because design actually means doing something on purpose in a particular way to achieve a desired effect. Now, if you do that just based on a whim, bet all of the product and everything that comes afterwards on that whim. And what's the likelihood of that going well? Well, we see it in practice. It doesn't really go well. But the tricky thing is you cannot evade that. You cannot say, I just won't have a design, because even if nobody ever talks about design or just put something out there that the developer created, it still has a design. It's there. It has an interface. So that's why I think you need a process that can actually ensure that you get from a point where you don't know what should be in the interface to a point where you know that the stuff that's in there and the way it is in there actually reflects reality. So that's evidence-based design as a process.
That's awesome. Yeah. So let's kind of bring it to the tactical for a second. And if you are a medtech innovator, you have a product, hardware, there's some software enabled, and you're going to have a graphical user interface as part of your solution. Like, when should people start thinking about GUI and really investing time into the design of their GUI? Like, what point in that early development process?
I think what's important to know is that it's an iterative process. So that means you don't have to do everything at once. And also you don't have to have immediately the right interface. You can have something that is wrong, but it's there.
Yeah.
And so I would say as soon as you know that the hardware can be made to work, that's the point where you can start to think about design of the user interface. The reason for that being that the user interface is that point where the hardware interacts with what people need. Then, of course, people are part of the process. So that's the meeting point. And if you start to think about that interface, even at the most rudimentary level, at that point, you start to learn about what the requirements actually are of the hardware. You might have an intuition of what they are, but when you start to make decisions or to face this element of how do we put everything into this tiny screen, you'll start to notice more of the details of what is important, what's less important, what are the parameters for this and that. So I think you can start as early as possible, and it is completely acceptable to start on your own without being an expert. You don't have to be a designer to start with design. At some point you will need someone who's a pro, but in the early phases it's actually a good thing for you to practice that, because it's exactly as I said, it's that meeting point between your users who overlap to some extent with the customers, with the systems that you're playing in, the technical, the legal, the business aspect of it, and also how can you make something interact.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, there's a really great product development company that's Torrance is a friend that works there called Spanner Product Development. They're out in the Bay Area. And, when they're working on projects, they'll a lot of the times, they'll do it'll be like in the prototype phase, it'll be a works like the real thing prototype. And then they do after that, it looks like the real thing, right? Because again, function first, but then also I'm just thinking like, yeah, that is the jump off point, right? Where you need to really start be thinking about the GUI because like you said, those factors. So like, does this thing need to be, reusable, rugged, sterilized with an alcohol wipe, sterilized in an autoclave? Does it have to withstand this, right? Like then that's going to determine the resolution, the size, the color variants, right? Like what color options do you have? Is this like an old colorless Game Boy type screen or are you going to have like a touch LCD screen, right? Like button placement, are they raised? Are they embedded? Like there's just so many things about the form factor of the GUI that crystallize at that point where like, okay, we've got it, we're putting together hardware and it works. So I totally agree. So like in your mind, and I'm trying to think in my head of like, kind of like, I'm not a graphical person. I've like, I'm a Canva warrior. I'm starting to learn how to use Figma better and better, right? So I'm kind of putting my like, me 8 years ago, 10 years ago hat on and like, how would I get from like an idea to a working GUI? So say like I'm at that jump off point, right? I'm starting to put together some hardware and maybe I've even like wireframed a user journey a little bit, right? But like nothing actually putting together a GUI. Like what do you suggest people do at the very initial to like start working on like a GUI concept?
You mentioned one of them, that's thinking about the potential flow. It means the steps that I would go through to do something. And you can think about this at the most abstract level, so not necessarily in terms of screens in the interface, but just what would I need to do as a professional using this thing. That's one element that you can start to think of. The other one is take the most important screens and just try to put the stuff in there that ideally would be there. Just, I don't know, put it in form of rectangles, makeup buttons, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's very easy to do, especially if you can let go of perfectionism. It's even fun to do because that already clarifies a lot about what are the boundaries of this thing.
Yeah.
It also shows you, even if I just put everything in there as a small rectangle, it doesn't fit. So clearly, if I'm going to transform this into a more engaging design, it will definitely not fit. That means I can rework the journeys and so on. So this is where the process becomes iterative. And I think you can run quite a few iterations, as many as you feel comfortable with. When you reach the point where you're thinking, well, I'm spending a lot of time on this, it doesn't really progress much, that's probably the point where you should hire a pro who will of course go about this process in a much more structured way and it's going to take a life of its own, but that's the starting point. And the thinking that you put in at that level is not lost because when you're making those choices about, I need to put all of this stuff into one screen, there's a reason for that. And we know it's wrong because it doesn't fit, but the question then becomes, why did you think you need all of that? And that actually makes for those very fascinating conversations that actually turn design into something better. And that's a data point in the design decision-making process that's going to be used by the pros and everyone else who's involved.
Yeah. And I think what you said about like, creating those like lo-fi grayscale, just rectangle boxes and placing them everywhere, I feel like especially if you're not a super design-oriented person, that can help remove a ton of like potential distractions because you're not thinking about, oh, what color is it? Well, what color is the border outline? Where do I put it in here? It's like, no, it's just grayscale boxes, put it where you think you want to have it. And you're kind of like limiting the variables, right? So you stay a little bit more focused and on track. So let's talk about that, right? So I feel like, compared to machining, titanium or in getting injection molding tooling, one advantage that GUI has is the ability to kind of prototype and iterate, right? Kind of GUI concepts, even if it's most basic level, like these lo-fi rectangles. So talk to me about how you guys think about A/B testing, A/B, ABC testing type stuff with GUI concepts. And is there an element, I know we haven't dove in on this yet, but like, is there an element of evidence-based design that's kind of like this kind of A/B testing is core to?
I mean, A/B testing is a method that you can use. It's basically where you compare two options and see how they perform. I think this is part of the larger thinking where what we always say is we create designs with the intent of destroying them. It means we try out a number of options. Ideally, they would have some sort of basis in terms of explicit assumptions, where we're saying people probably do this or they will do the other thing, and this gives us different designs. And then we try to destroy them, just like in science, where you formulate a theory and then you try to disprove it. You're not validating it. People in business keep saying we've validated things. No, nobody has ever validated anything. You can only invalidate something. And so in science, you formulate a lot of theories and then you keep trying to disprove them, and the ones that survive are the better ones, but also this whole process makes the theories change into something that's better. Well, the same thing happens with design, and A/B testing is a form of that. You can create 2 or 3 prototypes that are different and just have people interact with that and try to measure something. You can keep it qualitative, you can give it sort of a quantitative impression. Of course, you're not going to test with thousands of people, but still you can try to measure certain things. That's going to give you data points and facts. Because the right method to design is evidence-based design, because then it's not a trap anymore. And it involves 3 pillars, really. One of them is amassing as many facts or data as much as you can at this level that is no fact is ultimate, but it is a lot more than an opinion. And if you bring in together more perspectives, such as an A/B test, such as interviews, such as benchmarking, whatever it is, if you bring in more of these, you will start to notice patterns where they overlap and where they contradict each other. And that's then interesting, even where you see a contradiction. Some users say this, the others say that. The question becomes why. That's the thing that teaches you, and based on that, you can make a lot better decisions. Because the second pillar of evidence-based design is exactly having a process where these facts can collide with designs in a decision-making process, because design isn't art. Design is really a decision-making process, and to create a product you need hundreds, even thousands of decisions. So a lot of them will be wrong, but what you want is a system that creates a bias towards better decisions.
Yeah.
And that involves the third pillar, which is the element that you also mentioned in a way that you alluded to, where I think you need a no bullshit culture where the best thing wins and there's no place for politics. But if you use the facts, if you have that process, what happens is that the better things become obvious and the worst ones also become obvious that they're not the right thing, and so the facts can win. If you have these 3 pillars, then if you keep repeating the process, going through it, you keep getting better at it, you'll have a better result. Of course, having done it many, many times is different from doing it the first time, because even, getting one of those 3 components right once is difficult. You want to get all of them right all the time. But if you don't even try, you're lost. There's no chance you're going to win. If you try, I think you can get better at it, and you will see the results.
Yeah, I don't know that I've thought about it that way, in the sense that like good design and really the kind of like design throughout the product development process is like a reductive endeavor, right? Like you're pulling things away that you're invalidating to leave what is in essence like the most valuable pieces of it, right? And some of that's right with customer discovery, user interviews, just getting users' hands on it. But like I think if going forward with that thesis, that idea of okay, like good design, you're actually pulling things away and you're invalidating elements of it to leave just the most important parts, then like you also have to start with kind of a palette or options that are robust or ample enough, right, in the number and in the kind of what you're giving them to work off of. So like if you fall in love with one design, too early, and then maybe you only bring people 2 designs to look at, right? Like they may pick them apart, and like in reality, if you brought 3 or 4 or 5, there would have been things that they would have liked or kept or made sure that they took off or nitpicked on those other 3, that like the orchestra of like what's left when you say, okay, how are we going to like, generate some V2 designs, right? You're kind of missing some things, right? Because you didn't have enough sample size to pull from on that initial, right?
Yeah, and I think, there's an interesting parallel with this and with the experience of being an entrepreneur, because you do a lot of things, but I think there's always this element of the fear of failure, because there's the fear that you're going to do something and it's not going to be the case that the thing will be invalidated, but you will be invalidated because you've done it and you've put all your heart into it. And of course that is frightening. And the same thing happens to designers who don't follow this process, because they create a design and then someone says, this is just not it. And then they feel hurt. But of course, it's never about the designer. It's about the design. And the designer is removed from the design if they follow the right process. That's why the same type of thinking actually happens in product development in general and in entrepreneurship, where it's not about you. It's about just finding what works in reality and why it works, bringing it to the people, putting together a system that can deal with the complexity and be sustainable. And that is an element of, as you said, reducing things, testing them, seeing what remains, and putting them together in a new way, destroying that as well. It's just the way everything goes, right? Everything is constant change.
This is awesome. I love that that entire part. That was really good. So I'm curious, like, are you guys using anything, Bolt, Lovable? There's some kind of like low code, no code things like Cursor. I know Cursor is a little bit more back end stuff, but like, are you guys using any AI agents or AI tools as kind of like a supplemental assist in any of your design process?
Well, we do our best to use as much as possible. The thing with AI is that if you want something that's of any quality, I don't think it has that much to offer yet. But we're also developing a tool on our own, which is called a Compass. And what it does is it tries to assess the complexity of a user interface. Because complexity kills the ability for human interaction. It's like pesticide for people's ability to interact with something or even to cope with reality. So it's easy to say, well, if I have just one button, that's a lot less complex than if I have 25 on a page. Sure, anybody can say that. But as soon as you have, a distinction between how you organize the same number of buttons, it's difficult as a human being to appreciate the level of complexity. So what Compass does is it uses computer vision to determine visual complexity. It can only determine visual complexity. It doesn't know what things mean to people. But we use that in order to compare designs and to be able to call more quickly, well, if we've made this change, does this now actually improve complexity or doesn't it? This is something that we're developing. It already works. We want to make it work better. And then, of course, the big question is, how can we get other designers to use this? Because we'll have to see whether everybody wants to do things at a higher level and, put in more effort. Also deal with this element of a tool telling them what you've done here isn't right. It might not be the most appealing commercial proposition, but for now, we're just doing it for ourselves.
That's so awesome, that complexity tool. But I mean, at the end of the day, like you said, it's a tool, right? It doesn't have to be like a definitive decision point in design where scores below this and above this, have certain pathways that they go down. But I love that. I mean, I think it really well aligns with kind of the Creative Navy evidence-based design thesis. Yes, design is subjective. It is also objective in a lot of ways based on the data points driving it. So I think that taking that kind of like view of complexity of a design, saying, yeah, subjective qualities for sure, but there are also objective ways that we can measure, right, complexity. And there's a saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it to a degree, right? So I think that's a cool tool. I have no doubt that designers are going to be interested in that, even if just for like a quality check, like, hey, I love this design. Before I ship this to a customer or a client, like I'd like to just run it through and double check. You know what I mean? It's like almost like double checking it. Are these Pantone colors, right? Like, am I going to be asking anything? Are these going to need to be printed? It's just, people use tools like that to check all the time. Something that made me think of as we were going through that, kind of like the A/B testing, human factors, and complexity piece. How much do you guys use eye tracking because I'm thinking like I'm doing a human factors evaluation of somebody using an interface like a pump, right? If I could have a little camera mounted that is pump turns on, I see where their eyes go first, second, third, when they're doing specific operations on and sequences, and then kind of attaching that to like the relative score versus error prone near misses, as well as like the speed and efficiency that they went through it. I'm just curious if like eye tracking is a piece of that, because I feel like it's like maybe hard to do, but like the tech's certainly there today to do it.
Yeah, and it's a lot more available than it used to be 10 years ago. It sounds as if it's sci-fi, but actually it's, anybody can get those eye trackers actually. We do use that. The thing is, that's just one data point. And sometimes the sequence in which people see things doesn't matter that much. But the example you gave where something changes in the interface, just a state of the device or whatever it is, that's something where you would want to make sure people notice that. And that's the question, well, do they and to what extent? And that's where an eye tracker can really help. So it's a fantastic piece of technology. There's also AI tools, or they're not even AI tools. They used to exist even before AI that can approximate that. It's not like the real thing. What I want to say is it's very cheap and easy to do. It sounds as if it's sci-fi, but look, it's a data point that's accessible. Yeah. There's no reason not to use it.
Yeah. So one of my last questions here, and we could probably talk about this like forever, but like, it's always interesting when you're doing design and you really get into it and you're like, okay, like, do I put a button here? Like, even just within a button, right? Do I put an icon here? Do I put an icon and words? Do I just put a word here? I'm just like, if you could just allude, briefly to like kind of how you make those decisions between icon versus words versus like a pairing of icons and words on things.
This actually reminds me of, this is a question we used to get is, why does it take so long to create a button? And then we actually created a blog post to show, the process to create a simple button. But this is a great question because, in an ideal world, what you would have is both the text label and the icon. Because an icon is very easy to, it's such an open thing. You have a dog as an icon. Well, what does it mean? Does it mean dog? Does it mean vet? Does it mean going out? While as dog means dog, the word is
but
clear.
The inferred meaning can be different, right?
Yes.
Like behind it.
Exactly. And so ideally you would have both, but if you do that, you end up with a system in which everything is the same and it probably doesn't fit. So if you have, for example, something that is an action, that's probably where the text label would be highly important because it tells you what's actually going to happen if I press this. Whereas if it's a menu, that's an icon that everybody knows. That's where you can just use a pattern that people get to know because it's a cultural thing in the meantime. Of course, you have to juggle all of that all the time and also the different states that buttons have to go through. So it's a tiny thing, but it can be complex. But then there are more facets to it. There's also the element of making it international. You use a text label, great. Now you have to translate it every time you want to put it into a different market. All of these things you have to consider.
Yeah, I mean, international ISO standard labels, right? Like, it's kind of a nice thing that exists because it's applicable all over the world, right? But no, that's that's really interesting. So I'll maybe end here. This is kind of last question. Like, what can you do on your own as an entrepreneur? And like we already talked about kind of like when to maybe engage somebody like a designer for like GUI, but like, if there's anyone out there that's like, look, I'm going to go and start working on GUI. I'm going to do my boxes, the grayscale. Like, what are some other things, or kind of like what in total, like, is a dream client going to bring to you when they're ready to engage, like Creative Navy for design services?
Well, if we were to get a set of information, then it would be easy for us to predict the total effort involved, and it would be easy to come up with a strategy. And that would mean that it would be great for us to know an idea of what all the screens would be, or what the processes are, the things people need to do, and then, if possible, within each step, what would need to be in the screen. This can be rough, it doesn't have to be complete, but the more we know about it, the more we know the boundaries of things. And that tells us the approach. For example, last week I had a conversation with a company, and they were expecting the design to be 10 times more in terms of the effort than it actually was. So they over-appreciate it. Or maybe it's more common for people to underappreciate the effort. But the point is, if you can offer a perspective on what a known universe is at a given time, that's highly instructive, and then we can take it from there. If you also have any thoughts in terms of who are my users, what are their needs, again, this can be just iteration number one, but it is a starting point. This also helps because it shows us, well, what would we need to do in terms of research to complete this bigger picture. And that's where we would take it from. But ultimately, we've had projects where we started off a single line or just an email, not even a follow-up call to dive more into it because there just wasn't time. So you can start from anywhere, but the more ambiguity you have in the beginning, the more convoluted the whole approach will seem, or it will need to be in the beginning. Where what I would also say is that, again, this is something that sets you apart from an incumbent. You don't to commit to a huge thing because there's lots of unknowns, and then you do everything because there's a formula, it's a ritual. You have to stay pragmatic. Sometimes we have projects where we start on Monday with a plan, and on Tuesday we realize that we should be doing something else entirely for the rest of the week, and then we just change. This is the kind of agility that you need in order to be fast, to put something out there that is winning and that actually speaks to the users.
That's awesome. Man, I could talk to you all day. Didn't ask you about like drop shadows and gradients and the use of colors. Really, we could, I'm sure we could go for like another full hour, but like we'll wrap it here. Dennis, I can't thank you enough. This was like so fascinating and captivating. We will put, the link to Dennis's LinkedIn, Creative Navy's website, their LinkedIn page. We'll have all of that in the show notes for you guys. But like, Dennis, I can't thank you enough. I hope this was fun for you because like, I feel like I learned a ton and like had a blast doing it.
It was a lot of fun because it seems that you're also very much into this, and you've been there in the trenches and spent a lot of time with designers or trying to design yourself, and that shows. But what I really like is that you've kept your enthusiasm for design. I think that's a great thing to have.
Yep, I've tried. I'm not great at it, but I am passionate about it. I'll say that. So, Dennis, thank you again. Everybody that tuned in and stuck with us through the full podcast, thanks for tuning in, and have a great week. Take care. Thank you.